Imagine for a second that you're stepping out of the freezing, brutal, dark, and right into the warmth of a roaring fire. Well, today we're stepping back into the mists of an ancient oral tradition to explore the absolute oldest surviving epic of our language. We're talking about Beowulf. Let's dive right into this explainer. The translation we're looking at today is so fascinating because it treats the text not just as some dusty old manuscript you'd find in a library, but as a living, breathing performance. It's this massive tale of monsters, of kings, and a hero whose name literally echoes through the centuries. But even more than the story itself, we're going to look at how the language and the rhythm actually pull us into a world that is ancient, pretty brutal, and honestly profoundly beautiful. Right off the bat, our translator poses a really striking question in his preface. He asks, when we read this epic, do we hear what has been beautifully called the clanging tread of a warrior in mail? I mean, just let that imagery sink in for a second. The translator's entire goal here is to rescue Beowulf from feeling like dry, boring prose to our modern ears. He actually argues that trying to force the rough, martial music of Anglo-Saxon verse into smooth, modern blank verse or, airy ballad measures is a huge mistake. The gravity, the solemnity, the heavy iron footfalls of these warriors, that all has to be preserved. So we're following a pretty daring guide today, one who really wants us to feel the actual vibrations of the ancient world. To truly understand what's at stake in this poem, we have to understand the people, right? This epic brings our forefathers incredibly vividly before us. Their daily lives epitomized the pre-Alfredian eras, revolving around a really fierce love of war, the sea, and pure adventure. But the absolute pulsing heart of their society was the mead hall. You can kind of think of it as their ultimate community hub, this safe haven from the brutal, terrifying wilderness just outside the doors. It was the center of joy, of lighthearted laughter, where kings would lavish treasures on their liegemen. And in return, warriors gave absolute, unwavering loyalty to their lord. So when monsters show up to terrorize the mead hall, they aren't just killing people. No, they're attacking the very foundation of Teutonic civilization. They're threatening to completely extinguish their joy and their entire social order. Now, you might be wondering, how did the ancient bards actually tell this story? Well, they definitely didn't use end rhymes like you'd hear in a modern pop song. Instead, they relied on a really strict rhythmic structure. The secret sauce to this rhythm is something called the rhyme giver. Basically, that's the first accented syllable in the second half first, and it always carries the alliteration. Think of it as the anchor point of the spoken word. The bard, who was super mindful of these rhythms, would find word groups that were properly bound together by those repeating consonant sounds. So something like, grim and greedy he grasped on his journey. You hear that? It creates this propulsive, driving momentum that keeps the listener just completely locked into the tale. Okay, this modern musical analogy we're looking at perfectly captures exactly how we should hear the poem. Anglo-Saxon verse has 4 main stresses per line. Think of that like a driving, unyielding 4/4 drum beat. Boom, 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 boom. Then the alliteration functions like a repeating cymbal crash that really catches your ear. And that rhyme giver we just talked about, that is the heavy downbeat anchoring the next measure. Now, the translator does allow for some thesis and anacrusis, which is basically just a fancy way of saying unaccidented syllables. And those act like syncopated notes. They give the verse a regular breathing cadence, but without ever losing that heavy martial stomp. You see, you aren't just meant to read Beowulf. You are absolutely meant to feel its heartbeat. To actually pull this off, the translator had to use some incredible, super vivid compound words. He deliberately chose to give the text a decided flavor of archaism, to really honor that 8th century original. Words that just weren't in keeping with the spirit of the poem, they were completely cast aside. So forget regular fire. The breath of a dragon is vapory war sweat. A warrior isn't just a fighter, he's a foot-going champion. Now sure, these hyper-literal translations might feel a little strange at first glance, but they are highly intentional. They basically force our modern minds to step right out of the present and completely immerse ourselves in the rugged, primal atmosphere of the past. All right, let's jump into the story itself. Beowulf isn't just one quick adventure, it actually spans an entire lifetime. The timeline kicks off with a days-long sea voyage. Beowulf, who's this young warrior of the Geats with the literal strength of 30 men, hears that the Danish king Hrothgar has been suffering under a monster's terror for 12 agonizing years. So Beowulf arrives, and over the course of just a few nights, he slays that monster and its mother. And then? Well, we fast forward half a century. Beowulf rules his own people as a wise king for 50 years, leading right up to one final apocalyptic day where he has to face a fire drake. Let's look a bit closer at these three massive encounters. Our first monster is Grendel, who's actually a descendant of the murderous Cain. He is described as the great March Stepper, this terrifying giant dwelling out in the murky moor fens. And what drives his direful mischief? Pure, hateful jealousy. He is essentially the ultimate party pooper. Down in his dark, spooky fen dwelling, Grendel hears the light-hearted laughter and the dulcet harp music ringing out from Hrothgar's great mead hall, Heorot, and he just cannot brook this joy. So for 12 years, he visits the hall under the cover of night, ruthlessly dragging off sleeping thanes and devouring them. We're talking 30 men at a time, leaping and laughing as he heads back to his lair with a surfeit of slaughter. So, how exactly does our hero handle this unparalleled threat? Well, when Grendel comes bursting into the hall and seizes a sleeping warrior, Beowulf doesn't even draw a sword. Nope, he trusts entirely to his mighty hand grip. What follows is this fierce, desperate hand-to-hand struggle that literally wrecks the interior of the hall. Beowulf's legendary strength just proves to be way too much for the fell monster. In a brutal and, frankly, incredibly gory climax, Beowulf literally tears Grendel's arm and shoulder completely out of its socket. I mean, who needs a sword when you have a grip like that, right? The monster, just howling with agony, is forced to retreat back to his den to die. Joy bounds high in Heorot the next morning. But as we'll see, the relief is incredibly short-lived. Because literally the very next night, Grendel's mother comes looking for revenge. She is furious, she's raging, and she seizes one of Hrothgar's absolute favorite counselors before fleeing back to her watery domain. So Beowulf is summoned once again. He vows to purify Heorot entirely, but this time he arms himself heavily. He plunges right into the murky sea, swimming downward for literal hours. He's totally exhausted before the fight even begins, until he's finally dragged into a dry, roof-tall cavern down at the sea bottom. And there, surrounded by this strange, eerie firelight, he comes face to face with the mighty Mere-woman, Grendel's mother. Now, this second battle is vastly different from the first. It is a much, much closer brush with death. Beowulf swings his trusty sword, this falchion of renowned fame, but for the very first time, it fails him. It simply will not bite the monster. Forced once again to use his hand grapple, Beowulf actually stumbles and falls. The situation gets incredibly perilous here. Grendel's mother sits right on the foot-going champion, and she draws a wide-bladed, flashing war knife to avenge her only son. What saves Beowulf in this moment isn't just his brute strength, it's his close-woven breast armor, which blocks the edge, and ultimately, as the text points out, the will of God. He miraculously manages to find a massive ancient sword lying in the hoard, slays her, and swims upward in absolute triumph, carrying Grendel's head. After that, the hero is absolutely showered with treasures and returns home. But the poem doesn't just end with the glories of his youth. We jump forward a massive half a century. Beowulf is no longer this rash, young adventurer seeking glory in foreign lands. No, he is now the noble, beloved king of his own people, the Geats. He's ruled well and peacefully for 50 winters. But, as we know from the Teutonic worldview, peace is incredibly fragile, and fate is always waiting in the wings. Beowulf is forced to take up arms one last time, and there's a real deep tragedy here. He has to defend his home and his people at a time when he really should just be resting. And the threat this time around? It's apocalyptic. We're talking about a massive fire-spewing dragon, a horde warden who has been deeply enraged because someone stole a cup. And hey, if that sounds a little familiar to you, it's because J.R.R. Tolkien directly lifted this exact trope for Bilbo Baggins and Smaug and the Hobbit. The beast begins to woefully harry the land of the Geats with these hot gleaming fire waves. The old king, burdened with all the sorrows of his people, knows he absolutely has to face it. As Beowulf approaches the stone cave, the air grows impossibly thick. The breath of the monster issues forth first, that vapory war sweat we talked about, just boiling right out from the abyss. Beowulf lifts his shield, the earth re-echoes, and the ultimate inescapable fate of the Teutonic warrior begins. This final battle is just a tragedy in motion. The dragon charges out, completely wrapped in blazes. Beowulf strikes with his ancient iron sword, Nogling, but the weapon shivers and deceives him. There's this really bitter irony here. His immense strength has actually become a curse. His hand is simply too heavy, and the iron breaks. The fierce, raging fire drake charges again and sinks its bitter teeth deep into Beowulf's neck, his life's blood boiling. At this point, his warband, save for just one person,
flees in absolute terror. Only young Wiglaf, remembering the rings and all those mead hall promises, plunges through the bale smoke to aid his dying chieftain. Together they manage to slay the dragon, but the venom and the wounds are just too much. Beowulf, the great protector, falls.
In the end, a great memorial barrow is built on a promontory. It's a lasting tribute to a hero's bravery and gentleness, designed to be visible to sailors passing afar on the sea. Which brings us back around to the translator's devout desire from the preface, and honestly, the question we want to leave you with today. Will the story of Beowulf ever be as familiar to English-speaking peoples as the Iliad? It is, without a doubt, our first great epic. Every dragon, every dark lord, and every armored hero in modern fantasy owes a massive, undeniable debt to this exact poem. So hopefully, after feeling the clanging tread of this warrior today, you're inspired to go hear the music of the mead hall for yourself.